In the early morning hours of February 17, 1970, in the quiet military housing complex of Fort Bragg, North Carolina, a scene of unspeakable horror unfolded within the seemingly ordinary confines of a private residence. It began with a frantic phone call placed by Captain Jeffrey MacDonald, a highly respected physician in the U.S. Army Special Forces. His voice, raw with terror and shock, described a nightmare ripped from the headlines of a tumultuous era, a home invasion by a roving band of drug-crazed intruders, hippies with long hair and menacing words, who had brutally attacked his family. When military police arrived at 454 Castle Drive, they found a tableau of unimaginable violence: the lifeless bodies of MacDonald's pregnant wife Colette and their two young daughters, 5-year-old Kimberly and 2-year-old Kristen. Only Jeffrey MacDonald himself remained alive, though wounded. This horrific event would not merely be a tragic crime, but the genesis of one of America's most enduring and divisive true crime sagas. A decades-long battle over truth, justice, and the chilling question of who truly held the bloody knife. The initial account delivered by Jeffrey MacDonald from his hospital bed painted a vivid and horrifying picture. He claimed he had been asleep on the living room couch when he was awakened by his wife's screams. He fought valiantly, he said, against 3 male intruders and 1 female, all clad in dark clothing. He described a woman in a floppy hat chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs," and later, "God is dead." He recounted being stabbed multiple times, eventually losing consciousness as the intruders fled. When he awoke, he discovered the massacre of his family. Colette, 26 and pregnant with their 3rd child, had been brutally stabbed 21 times and beaten with a club. She had also suffered multiple stab wounds to her chest and abdomen and a crushed skull. Kimberly had been stabbed 8 to 10 times, and Kristen, too, suffered 33 stab wounds and numerous ice pick punctures. It was a scene of unparalleled savagery, seemingly confirming Jeffrey MacDonald's terrifying tale of a random, senseless act of counterculture violence. Initially, law enforcement seemed to accept MacDonald's version of events. Military police, specifically the U.S. Army Criminal Investigation Division (CID), launched an investigation. Their initial approach, however, would later come under severe criticism for its perceived sloppiness and inexperience in handling a complex triple homicide. The crime scene was not meticulously preserved, critical evidence was potentially mishandled, and some areas were not immediately secured. This initial laxity would contribute significantly to the enduring ambiguity of the case, allowing for various interpretations of forensic evidence in later years. The CID questioned MacDonald, but his status as a wounded military officer, a respected doctor, and seemingly the sole survivor of such a monstrous attack, seemed to insulate him from immediate intense suspicion. Within weeks, however, the narrative began to shift slowly, imperceptibly at first, then with increasing momentum. The CID investigators, particularly during more formal interviews with MacDonald, began to notice inconsistencies in his story. His wounds, though real, seemed superficial for someone who had allegedly fought off 4 armed assailants. The pattern of bloodstains throughout the house, meticulously documented by forensic experts, did not align with MacDonald's account of a struggle. Furthermore, the crime scene itself, despite the alleged presence of 4 intruders, appeared remarkably neat in some areas, almost staged. There were no signs of forced entry, no footprints other than those of the family, and no obvious signs of a struggle in the living room where MacDonald claimed to have fought. These discrepancies began to plant the first seeds of doubt in the minds of the military investigators.
As the CID investigation progressed, the focus gradually, almost imperceptibly, shifted from the elusive hippies to the grieving husband and father. The prosecution's theory, slowly taking shape, posited that MacDonald himself was the perpetrator and that he had staged the crime scene to appear as a home invasion. Their theory suggested a motive rooted in marital discord, perhaps exacerbated by drug use, though MacDonald vehemently denied any illicit drug use or financial pressure, leading to an argument that escalated into lethal violence. The prosecution would later argue that the multiple weapons used, a surgical scalpel, an ice pick, and a blunt instrument, were all items found within the MacDonald home. The blue pajamas MacDonald claimed he was wearing, and which he said had been torn by his attackers, were found neatly folded in his bedroom. This contrast between MacDonald's dramatic story and the forensic realities began to paint a very different, far more chilling picture. Crucially, the relationship between Jeffrey MacDonald and his in-laws, Freddie and Mildred Kassab, Colette's parents, played a pivotal role in the unfolding narrative. Initially, the Kassabs were unwavering in their support for MacDonald, believing his account of the horrific home invasion. They stood by him, publicly defending his character and mourning the loss of their daughter and grandchildren alongside him. Freddie Kassab, a former military man himself, was particularly vocal in his belief in MacDonald's innocence, even advocating for him with military authorities. Their support was a powerful endorsement, initially reinforcing the public's perception of MacDonald as a tragic victim. But however, as the months passed and as Freddie Kassab meticulously reviewed the extensive CID investigation files, which, unlike civilian cases, were made available to the family, his unwavering belief in MacDonald began to crack. Kassab, a man of methodical nature, started to identify the same inconsistencies that had troubled the CID. The timelines didn't match. The positions of the bodies and the bloodstains contradicted MacDonald's version of the struggle. The more Kassab delved, the more he became convinced that MacDonald was lying, that he was, in fact, the murderer. This agonizing realization that the man he had embraced as a son was actually responsible for the slaughter of his own family led Freddie Kassab to embark on a relentless, decades-long crusade for justice against his former son-in-law. His transformation from staunch supporter to determined accuser was a powerful turning point in the public narrative, planting profound seeds of doubt where there had once been only sympathy. The CID's internal investigation culminated in July 1970 with a formal Article 32 hearing, a military proceeding similar to a grand jury. After weeks of testimony, the presiding officer, Colonel Warren Rock, recommended that all charges against Jeffrey MacDonald be dropped due to insufficient evidence. This decision, seemingly a vindication for MacDonald, effectively cleared him within the military justice system. He was honorably discharged from the Army shortly thereafter, leaving Fort Bragg and attempting to rebuild his life in California, seemingly free from suspicion. For many, this military clearance was the definitive answer. The intruder theory was plausible, and MacDonald was an innocent victim. This outcome further complicated the public's perception, creating a powerful counter-narrative to the growing suspicion. But the story did not end there. Freddie Kassab, haunted by the brutal murders and convinced of MacDonald's guilt, refused to let the case die. He dedicated his life to pursuing justice for Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. He relentlessly petitioned the Justice Department, writing hundreds of letters, providing detailed analyses of the evidence, and presenting his compelling arguments for why the case needed to be reopened. His tireless advocacy, fueled by an agonizing sense of betrayal and a desperate need for closure, finally paid off. In 1974, the Justice Department reopened the investigation, now a civilian criminal inquiry, led by Assistant U.S. Attorney James Blackburn. This reinvestigation marked a critical phase where the lingering doubt about MacDonald's guilt began to solidify into a more focused pursuit.
The civilian investigation meticulously re-examined every piece of evidence, applying new forensic techniques and scrutinizing old testimonies with fresh eyes. They found additional inconsistencies in MacDonald's story, further bolstering their theory of internal homicide. In 1975, a federal grand jury was convened in Raleigh, North Carolina. After months of hearing testimony and reviewing evidence, the grand jury returned an indictment against Jeffrey MacDonald for the murders of his family. The indictment was a monumental development, igniting a new wave of public attention and reigniting the fierce debate over his guilt or innocence. MacDonald, now practicing medicine in California, vehemently denied the charges, claiming he was being persecuted by a government unwilling to admit its own investigative failures. The battle lines were clearly drawn. The trial of Jeffrey MacDonald began in July 1979 in Raleigh, North Carolina, nearly a decade after the murders. It was a high-stakes legal battle, captivating the nation with a narrative that unfolded in excruciating detail. The prosecution, led by James Blackburn and Brian Murtaugh, meticulously presented their case, emphasizing the forensic evidence that they argued debunked MacDonald's intruder story. They pointed to the minimal nature of MacDonald's wounds, arguing they were self-inflicted to support his fabricated narrative. They presented expert testimony regarding the blood spatter patterns, arguing that the blood evidence on MacDonald's pajamas, found neatly folded, was inconsistent with the violent struggle, but consistent with him being the attacker. Crucially, the prosecution focused on tiny blue pajama fibers and threads from MacDonald's pajama top, which were found on the bodies of all three victims, under Kimberly's fingernails, and even on the murder weapons. They also presented evidence of green and clear synthetic fibers, consistent with MacDonald's bedspread, found on Colette's body and the ligatures. This fiber evidence was a cornerstone of the prosecution's case, suggesting an intimate contact between MacDonald, his victims, and the murder weapons within the confines of his own bedroom, not a random, chaotic attack by intruders. The prosecution's narrative was chillingly precise. MacDonald, after killing his family, had attempted to clean the crime scene and then staged it to appear as a random violent home invasion, planting the elements that would support his elaborate lie. The defense, led by attorney Bernard Siegel, mounted a vigorous counterargument, emphasizing the military's initial mishandling of the crime scene and contending that it was the true source of all the ambiguity. They argued that the contamination of the scene, the lack of proper documentation, and the failure to collect all crucial evidence created a situation where any interpretation was possible. They pointed to their own experts who contradicted the prosecution's forensic interpretations, asserting that the blood and fiber evidence was consistent with MacDonald's struggle against intruders. They also presented witnesses who claimed to have seen individuals fitting the description of MacDonald's alleged attackers in the vicinity of Fort Bragg around the time of the murders. The defense tirelessly hammered home the intruder theory, arguing that the prosecution's case was built on speculation and misinterpretation, and that MacDonald was a victim of a grave injustice. The trial was emotionally charged, filled with graphic testimony, expert duels over minute forensic details, and the constant shadow of the conflicting narratives. The jury, after lengthy deliberation, returned a verdict. On August 29, 1979, Jeffrey MacDonald was found guilty on 3 counts of murder. He was sentenced to 3 consecutive life terms in prison. The verdict sent shockwaves across the country. For the Kassabs, particularly Freddie, it was the culmination of years of agonizing dedication, a hard-won victory in their relentless pursuit of justice. For others, particularly MacDonald's remaining supporters, it was a profound miscarriage of justice, the conviction of an innocent man. The formal legal system had slowly, through the painstaking process of a federal trial, brought the killer into the light. It was the man who had claimed to be the sole survivor.
The conviction, however, was far from the end of the story. Jeffrey MacDonald vehemently maintained his innocence from behind bars,
launching a relentless series of appeals over the ensuing decades. His case became a cause célèbre for those who believed in his innocence, generating books, documentaries, and fervent online communities. One of the most famous aspects of the saga was the book Fatal Vision by Joe McGinnis, published in 1983. McGinnis, a journalist, spent extensive time with MacDonald, initially intending to write a sympathetic account. However, he gradually became convinced of MacDonald's guilt, and the book presented a devastating portrait of MacDonald as a narcissistic psychopath. Fatal Vision became a bestseller, deeply influencing public opinion and solidifying the perception of MacDonald's guilt for many. MacDonald later sued McGinnis for fraud, claiming he was misled, a lawsuit that ended in a hung jury, but further highlighted the bitter division surrounding the case. MacDonald's appeals ranged from claims of prosecutorial misconduct to newly discovered evidence, including allegations of a woman named Helena Stokely, a known drug user from the Fort Bragg area, having confessed to being part of the intruder group. Stokely had indeed given conflicting statements over the years, sometimes admitting involvement, sometimes denying it, complicating the narrative and offering a persistent alternative theory for the defense. However, none of these appeals ultimately succeeded in overturning his conviction. Courts consistently upheld the original verdict, citing the compelling nature of the forensic evidence presented at trial. Decades passed, Jeffrey MacDonald remained incarcerated, a prominent figure in the true crime landscape, forever protesting his innocence. His story, however, evolved from an initial tale of a random brutal attack to a complex psychological drama meticulously detailed by investigators, lawyers, and journalists. The ambiguity that characterized the initial hours of the investigation was slowly, incrementally, replaced by a picture meticulously pieced together by the prosecution. The doubt that was planted by MacDonald's initial narrative and later sustained by his appeals and loyal supporters was slowly eroded by the weight of forensic evidence and the meticulous work of those determined to find justice for Colette, Kimberly, and Kristen. The case of Jeffrey MacDonald remains a chilling and deeply unsettling chapter in American criminal justice. It is a testament to the fact that appearances can be profoundly deceiving, and that the most monstrous acts can be committed by those who seem to be beyond reproach. It is a story of how a single devastating event can unravel a family, divide a nation, and spark a legal battle that transcends decades. The ultimate verdict of the courts, upheld through numerous appeals, brought the killer into the light of conviction. Yet for some, the doubt, seeded so early and cultivated so passionately, persists, leaving the MacDonald family murders as an enduring, haunting enigma in the annals of true crime, where the vision of the tragic truth remains fatally clear for some and disturbingly obscured for others.